Okay, are you ready for Chapter 5? Remember, it's called Puddleglum. We just finished Chapter 4, A Parliament of Owls. Jill was asleep. Ever since the Owls' Parliament began, she had been yawning terribly, and now she had dropped off. She was not at all pleased at being woken again and at finding herself lying on bare boards in a dusty belfry sort of place, completely dark and almost completely full of owls. She was even less pleased when she heard that they had to set off somewhere else, and not, apparently, for bed. On the owl's back they had to go. "Oh, come on, Pole, buck up," said Scrub's voice. "After all, it is an adventure." "Well, I'm sick of adventures," said Jill crossly. She did, however, consent to climb onto Glimfeather's back, and she was thoroughly woken up, for a while anyways, by the unexpected coldness of the air when he flew out with her into the night. The moon had disappeared, and there were no stars. Far behind her, when she looked back, she could see a lighted single window well above the ground, doubtless in one of the towers of the castle of Cair Paravel. It made her long to be back in that delightful bedroom, snug in bed, watching the firelight from the fireplace on the walls. She put her hands under her cloak and wrapped it tightly around her. It was uncanny to hear two voices in the dark air a little distance ahead. Scrub and his owl were talking to one another. "Well, he doesn't sound tired," thought Jill. She didn't realize that he had been on great adventures in this world before, and that the Narnia air was bringing back to him a strength he had won when he sailed the Eastern Sea with King Caspian. Jill had to pinch herself to keep awake, for she knew that if she dozed on Glimfeather's back, she'd probably fall off. When at last the two owls ended their flight, she climbed stiffly off of Glimfeather and found herself on flat ground again. A chilly wind was blowing, and they appeared to be in a place without any trees. "To-woo, to-woo," Glimfeather was calling. "Wake up, Puddleglum, wake up, it is on the lion's business." For a long time, there was no reply. And then a long way off, a dim light appeared and began to come nearer. And with the light came a voice. "Oh, owls ahoy," it said. What is it? Is the king dead? Has an enemy landed in Narnia? Is it a flood? Is it a dragon?" When the light finally reached them, it turned out to be that of a large lantern. She could see very little of the person who held it. He seemed to be all legs and arms. The owls were talking to him, explaining everything, but she was just too tired to listen. She tried to wake herself up a bit when she realized they were saying goodbye to her, and she could never remember afterwards much about that, except sooner or later she and Scrub were stooping to enter a low doorway, and then, oh, thank heavens, they were lying down on something soft and warm, and she could hear a voice saying to her, "There you are, best we can do. You'll lie cold and hard, damp too, I shouldn't wonder. Won't sleep a wink, most likely, even if there isn't a thunderstorm or a flood or the wigwam doesn't fall down on top of us all, as I've known them to do. Must make the best of it." But she was fast asleep before the voice had ended talking. When the children woke up late next morning, they found that they were lying very dry and very warm on beds of straw in a dark place. All they could see was a triangular opening letting in the daylight. "Where on earth are we?" asked Jill. "Oh, we're in the wigwam of a marshwiggle," said Eustace. "A what?" "A marshwiggle. Don't ask me what it is. I couldn't see it last night, but I'm getting up. Let's go take a look at it." "Well, how beastly one feels after sleeping in one's own clothes," said Jill, standing up. "I was just thinking how nice it was not to have to get dressed," said Eustace. "Or wash either, I suppose," said Jill scornfully, but Scrub had already got up, yawned, shaken himself a bit, and crawled out of the wigwam. So Jill did the same. What they found outside was quite unlike the bit of Narnia they'd seen on the day before. They were on a great flat plain which was cut into countless little islands by countless channels of water. The islands that these channels of water made were covered with coarse grass and bordered with reeds and rushes. Sometimes there were beds of rushes, about an acre in extent, in size. Clouds of birds were constantly landing on them and rising from them: ducks, snipe, bitterns, herons. Many wigwams, like the one they had been in, where they spent the night, could be seen dotted around them, but all of them were at a good distance from one another. For marsh-wiggles are people who, well, they like their privacy. Except for the fringe of the forest several miles to the south and west of them, there wasn't a tree in sight. Eastward in the flat marsh stretched to low sandhills on the horizon, and you could tell by the salt tang in the wind which blew from that direction that the sea lay over that way. To the north there were low, pale-colored hills, in places bastioned with rock. The rest was all flat marsh. It would have been a depressing place on a wet evening. Seen under a morning sun, with a fresh wind blowing and the air filled with the crying of birds, there was something fine and fresh and clean about its loneliness. The children felt their spirits starting to rise. "Now, where has this thingagummy got to, I wonder?" said Jill. "It's called a marsh-wiggle," said Scrub, as if he were rather proud of remembering the word. "I expect, hello, that must be him there." And then they both saw it sitting with its back to them, fishing, about 50 yards away. It had been hard to see at first because it was nearly the same color as the marsh and because it sat so still. "Well, I suppose we'd better go speak to it," said Jill, and Scrub nodded. They both felt just a little nervous walking up to it. As they drew nearer, the figure turned its head and showed them a long, thin face with rather sunken cheeks, a tightly shut mouth, a sharp nose, and no beard. It was wearing a high pointed hat like a steeple, with an enormously wide, flat brim on the hat. The hair it had, if it could even be called hair, which hung over its large ears, was greeny gray, and each lock of hair was flat rather than round, so that they looked like tiny reeds. The expression on its face was solemn, its complexion was muddy, and you could see at once that it took a very serious view of life. So can you kind of picture him a little bit? Hard to, isn't it, when you don't really know what a marsh-wiggle looks like? "Oh, good morning, guests," it said. "Though when I say good, I don't mean it won't probably turn to ruin or rain, or it might even be snow or fog or thunder. You didn't get any sleep, I'll bet." "Oh, yes, we did," said Jill. "We had a lovely night." "Ah," said the marsh-wiggle, shaking his head, "I see you're making the best of a bad job. That's right. You've been well brought up, you have. You've learned to put a good face on a thing." "Please, we don't know your name," said Scrub. "Oh, Puddleglum's my name. But it doesn't matter if you forget it. I can always tell you again." The children sat down on each side of him. They could now see that he had very long legs and arms, so that although his body wasn't much bigger than a dwarf's, he would be taller than most men when he stood up. The fingers of his hands were webbed like a frog's, and so were his bare feet, which dangled in the muddy water. He was dressed in earth-colored clothes that hung loosely on him. "I'm just trying to catch a few eels to make an eel stew for dinner," said Puddleglum, "though I shouldn't wonder if I don't catch any. And you won't like them much if I do, I imagine." "Oh, why not?" said Scrub. Why, it's not in reason that you should like our sort of food, though I've no doubt you'll put a bold face on it. All the same, while I'm catching of them, if you two could try to light the fire, no harm trying. The wood's behind the wigwam. It might be wet. You could light it inside the wigwam, and then we'd all get smoke in our eyes, or you could light it outside, and then the rain would come and put it out. Here's my tinder box." And he handed it to them. "You wouldn't know how to use it, I expect." But Scrub had learned that sort of thing in his last adventure in Narnia. The children ran back together to the wigwam, found some wood, which was perfectly dry, of course, and they succeeded in lighting a fire with rather less than the usual difficulty. Then Scrub sat and took care of it while Jill went and had some sort of a wash. Not a very good wash, but she washed in the nearest channel. After that, she saw to the fire and he had a wash, and both felt a good deal fresher and cleaner, but very hungry. Pretty soon the marsh wiggle joined them. In spite of his expectation of catching no eels, he had a dozen or so of them, and he'd already skinned and cleaned them. He put on a big pot, mended the fire, and lit his pipe. Now, marsh wiggles smoke a very strange, heavy-set kind of tobacco. Some people say they even mix it with mud. And the children noticed the smoke from Puddleglum's pipe hardly rose in the air at all. It trickled out of the bowl and dropped to the ground downwards and drifted along the ground like a mist. It was very black, and it set Scrub to coughing when he smoked it. Now, said Puddleglum, those eels will take a mortal long time to cook, and either of you might faint with hunger before they're done. I know a little girl, but I better not tell you that story. It might lower your spirits, and, well, that's a thing I never try to do. So, to keep your minds off your hunger, we may as well talk about our plans. Well, yes, let's do, said Jill. Can you help us to find Prince Rilian? The marsh wiggle sucked in its cheeks until they were hollower than you would have thought possible. Well, I don't know that you'd call it help exactly, he said. I don't know that anyone can exactly help. It stands to reason we're not likely to get very far on our journey to the north. Well, not at this time of the year, with the winter coming on soon and all. And an early winter, too, by the look of things. But you mustn't let that make you downhearted. Very likely, what with enemies and mountains and rivers to cross and losing our way and, well, next to nothing to eat and sore feet, we'll hardly notice the weather. And if we don't get far enough to do any good, well, we might get far enough not to get back in a hurry. Both children noticed that he said we while he was talking, not you, and both of them exclaimed at the same moment, Are you coming with us? Oh, yes, I'm coming, of course. Might as well, you see. Well, I don't suppose we'll ever see the king back in Narnia now that he's once set off for foreign parts. And, well, he'd had a nasty cough when he left. And then there's Trumpkin. You know Trumpkin. He's failing fast. And you'll find there have been a bad harvest after this terrible dry summer, and I shouldn't wonder if some enemy attacked us while the king is gone. And, well, mark my words, these things are going to happen. Well, how should we start? Said Scrub. Well, said the marsh wiggle very slowly. Well, all the others who ever went looking for Prince Rilian started from that same fountain where the Lord Drinian saw the lady. They went north, mostly, and as none of them ever came back, we can't exactly say how they did. Well, said Jill, we've got to start by finding a ruined city of giants. Aslan told us that. Got to start by finding it, have we? Answered Puddleglum. Not allowed to start by looking for it, I suppose. Well, that is what I meant, of course, said Jill, and that when we found it, yes, when, said Puddleglum very dryly. When indeed. Doesn't anyone know where it is? Asked Scrub. Well, I don't know about anyone, said Puddleglum, and I won't say I haven't heard of that ruined city. But you wouldn't start from the fountain, though. You'd have to go across Ettinsmuir. That's where the ruined city is, if it's anywhere. But I've been as far in that direction as most people, and I never got to any ruins, so I won't lie to you. Where's Ettinsmuir? Said Scrub. Well, if you look over there, northward, said Puddleglum, pointing with his pipe, see those hills and bits of cliff? That is the beginning of Ettinsmuir. But there's a river between it and us, the river Shribble, and no bridges, of course. Well, I suppose we can ford it, though, said Scrub. Ford it means like walk through it, walk across it, because it's not too deep. Well, it has been forded, admitted the marsh wiggle, and maybe maybe we'll meet people on Ettonsmuir who can tell us the rest of the way, said Jill. Well, you're right about meeting people, said Puddleglum. What sort of people live there? She asked. Well, it's not for me to say they aren't all right in their own way, answered Puddleglum, if you like their way. Yes, but what are they? Pressed Jill. There are so many different kinds of creatures in this country. Are they animals or some kind of birds or dwarfs or what? The marshwiggle gave a long whistle. Phew, it said. Don't you know? Well, I thought the owls had told you. The people there they're giants. Jill winced. She'd never really liked giants, even in books she'd read about them. And she'd once met one in a nightmare, but she'd met him, and then she saw Scrub's face, which had turned rather green. And she thought to herself, I bet he's in a worse funk about these giants than I am. So that made her feel a little bit braver. The king told me long ago, said Scrub, that time when I was with him at sea, that he'd jolly well beaten those giants in war, and he made them pay tribute. Well, that's true enough, said Puddleglum. They are at peace with us, all right, and as long as we stay on our side of the shrivel, they won't do us any harm, but over on their side, on the moor, you never know. Still, there's always a chance if we don't get near any of them, and if none of them forget themselves, and well, if we're not seen, it's just possible we might get a long way. Look here, said Scrub, suddenly losing his temper, as people so easily do when they've been frightened. I don't believe the whole thing can be half as bad as you're making out, any more than the beds in the wigwam were hard or the wood was wet. I don't think Aslan would ever have sent us if there was so little chance of success. He quite expected the marshwiggle to give him an angry reply after that, but it only said, well, that's the spirit, Scrub. That's the way to talk. Put a good face on it. But we all need to be very careful about our tempers, seeing all the hard times we'll have to go through together. Won't do to quarrel, you know. At any rate, don't begin it too soon. I know these expeditions usually end that way, knifing one another, I shouldn't wonder, before all's done. But the longer we can keep off it... Well, if you feel it so hopeless, interrupted Scrub, I think you'd better just stay behind. Pole and I can go on alone, can't we, Pole? Shut up and don't be an ass, Scrub, said Jill hastily, terrified lest the marshwiggle take him up at his word. Oh, don't you lose heart, Pole, said Puddleglum. I'm coming, sure and certain. I'm not going to lose an opportunity like this. It'll do me good. They all say, the other Wiggles all say that I'm too flighty, that I don't take life seriously enough. If they've said it once, they've said it 1,000 times. Puddleglum, they've said, you're altogether too full of bobbance and bounce and high spirits. You've got to learn that life isn't all fricasseed frogs and eel pipe. You want something to sober you down a bit. We're only saying it for your own good, Puddleglum. Well, that's what they say now. Now, a job like this, a journey up north just as winter is beginning, looking for a prince that probably isn't there, by way of around a ruined city that no one has ever seen, well, that'll be just the thing to sober me up. If that doesn't steady a chap, I don't know what will. And he rubbed his big frog-like webbed-fingered hands together as if he were talking of going to a party or a pantomime or something like that. And now, he added, let's see how those eels are cooking. When the meal came, it was delicious, and the children had 2 large helpings each. At first, the marshwiggle wouldn't believe that they really liked it, and when they had eaten so much that he had to believe them, he fell back on saying that it would probably disagree with them horribly after a bit. What's food for Wiggles? Maybe poison for humans. I shouldn't wonder, it said. Then after the meal, they had some tea in tins, kind of like you've seen men maybe, or working on the road, have drinking things out of a tin. And Puddleglum had a good many sips out of a square black bottle. He offered the children some of it, but they thought it was probably pretty nasty. The rest of the day was spent in preparations for an early start tomorrow morning. Puddleglum, being by far the biggest, said he would carry 3 blankets with a large bit of bacon rolled up inside them. Jill was going to carry the remains of the eels, a few biscuits, and the tinderbox. Scrub was to carry both his own cloak and Jill's cloak when they didn't want to wear them. Scrub, who had learned some shooting when he sailed to the east under Caspian, had Puddleglum's second best bow, and Puddleglum, of course, carried his best one. Though he said that with winds and damp bowstrings and bad light and cold fingers, it was 100 to 1 against any of them hitting anything. He and Scrub also both had swords. Scrub had brought the one which had been left out for him at his room in Cair Paravel, but Jill had to be content with her knife. There would have been a quarrel about this, but as soon as they started sparring, the Wiggle rubbed its hands and said, "Ah, there you are. I thought as much. That's what usually happens on adventures." And this made them both shut up and stop arguing. All 3, after they were ready, went to bed early in the wigwam. This time the children really had a rather bad night, not as good as the night before, which was because Puddleglum, after saying, "You'd better try for some sleep, you two, not that I suppose any of you will close an eye tonight," and then he instantly went off to sleep into such a loud, continuous snore that when Jill at last got to sleep, she dreamed all night about road drills and noisy waterfalls and being in an express train in a tunnel. And that's it for Puddleglum. Well, that's it for that chapter. He's going to stay with them for a while, it sounds like. Chapter 6 is called The Wild Wastelands of the North. So make sure you come back for that one, won't you?